right, it's going to be faster for me to explain like this, I think. So these dots represent points in what's called the factor analysis. Okay, so this one is for IQ, this one is for personality research. So when you're making a factor analysis to make one, basically what you do for personality is you think of every question you can ask someone. Do you like waking up in the morning? Do you usually smile when you do work? Are you a person who likes to pay attention to detail? Any question you can ask someone. Of course, I will stipulate the big five only uses neutral or positive traits. So they don't include traits like, are you an asshole, are you a liar, and things like that. When you use those, you get more clumping, what you see here. So you ask all those questions, and then what you do is you put those in a computer. This actually couldn't be done until we invented computers because the data sets are so massive. And you look at the correlation of someone saying that, oh, I said I strongly agree to wake you up in the morning, and I also said I strongly agree to liking social events, okay? So that there's a correlation between putting B and then C and then a D on all these different questions. And when you do that across all different questions, across all the different participants in your survey, what you get is statistical clumpings, okay? And so you can break this down a couple different ways. You have two big clumps here. This represents trait plasticity, your positive emotion traits, which do not vary. There's no connection, there's no correlation, negative or positive, between traits' stability. And then same, individually within these, so these two traits co-vary together. This is a clump, this is a clump, this is a clump. These co-vary together, but they're separate. And so this is what we call the Big Five model. So there's two major categories, and then within them they break down into 5, and then actually even within these, you can break these down to 10. But the reason why we don't do that is because the characteristics of personality that we're talking about get so fragmented that they lose predictive validity. So like for instance, in here, this would go to, let's say, this would go to conscientiousness. So this is stability. This would be a bracket of it, conscientiousness. And then within conscientiousness, we have politeness. And in theory, politeness does carry predictive validity for situations. But if you broke down politeness into 2 subcategories, I don't even know what they would be. Then they don't, because politeness as itself is kind of like one unit. I'm sure you could get at different differentiations, but you get the idea. IQ, on the other hand, is a little problematic. You get one clump, okay? Now what does that one clump mean? In the center here are the most difficult questions, okay? Now, how we determine what a difficult question is, it's just the questions that most people can't answer correctly. And these are obviously fact-based questions, they're not value-based questions like the personality stuff. And so, imagine you have a couple of questions. One is, can you repeat these numbers, a 10-digit number, starting in reverse. Okay, that's pretty easy. So now do that 10-digit number in reverse plus, I don't know, only name the prime numbers. You add a little step. Because the one that is harder, if you get that harder question correct, that one has more predictive validity than if you got an easier question correct. So in the center are all the hardest questions, the ones that only 1 in 1% can get. And if you get those right, then the likelihood, it increases. But if you just get this one right, the likelihood of you getting more questions right is pretty low. Now, that being said, there is a phenomenon, I mentioned this briefly, that I imagine the intelligence, the structure of it is almost like a flower. Okay, so a rose stem and an orchid bud, they look pretty much the same, and that would be like someone with you imagine 2 people with IQs of 80. There's not much difference as far as you don't have someone who's there's just not much difference. Versus you have 2 people who have IQs of 120, there'll be more differentiation as the figure gains more of its shape, you could say. So at that level, you might have something between a 20-point gap between someone's spatial intelligence and the linguistic. But you wouldn't expect to find a 20-point gap where you have someone with 100 spatial ability, reasoning, but have an 80 IQ. Okay, and man, I will just say, why is IQ research important? Because it is almost impossible in the social sciences to create a test that also doesn't capture IQ. Basically what I'm saying is, in social science, if you don't also have an IQ test on your research, you should just throw it out. Because it's very likely that if you included an IQ test, it would capture all the difference that you thought that you were measuring with your variable. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, like, how much difference is there between people on the bottom from people on the top? That's hard. There's really no like surefire way to gauge it. There is a correlation between brain to body mass ratio and intelligence, and brain size varies by a factor of 2 in human species. But that's not the same to say that someone at the top is twice as smart as someone at the bottom of the bell curve. Because, like, you know, try and compare how many more research papers someone at the top did versus someone at the bottom. You know what I mean? It's not even computable. I will say that people like in the top, like, well, you know, all that's not that important. I will just say that a big social problem, and this is important for politics, and people are talking about things like universal basic income, this is necessarily embedded in the statements they're making, and that's that the US military basically determined that if you have an IQ below 82, which is about 10% of the population, that there's nothing that they can productively train you to do. And that's obviously horrible because the military includes a whole plethora of jobs, and obviously you don't think the military needs people. Of anyone, they need volunteers. You know, it's all volunteer work, and yet they're rejecting people because they determined actually it's more costly to have you with us because you ask so many questions and then you make so many mistakes. And so that's sort of like a permanent unemployment issue. And so that's actually a very important social topic. Anyways, now more on the thing of specific multiple intelligences. Now, most of the forms of multiple intelligences don't really need explained. They fit into this right here. So like something like spatial intelligence and linguistic intelligence, although they diverge, they deeply co-vary, and they only diverge as IQ raises. So there's many ways to be smart, but there's one way to be not smart, is a way to look at that. But there are a couple that need a little further explaining. One of them would be kinesthetic ability. So kinesthetic ability is basically how athletic you are. I'm just going to ignore that because I think most people can kind of see that, well, if you want to call that intelligence, that's a bit of a stretch, like sure, like call it intelligence. I don't care. It's not, okay? And the other one would be something called EQ. Now, EQ is emotional intelligence. And what's the problem with EQ? It's real. It's valid. It predicts situations and predicts certain outcomes. But it's just the synthesis of trait agreeableness, which would be on this side, and intelligence. It's just that synthesis. So because it's already captured in this model, and that model, the Big Five, is an internationally used model, there are other different models besides Ocean. Big Five and Ocean are the same thing. But basically, there's not any substantial difference about the facts. They just do the statistical clumpings differently. You know what I mean? So, and those ones, empathy is still captured in their personality models. So there's really no room for multiple intelligences. It's not a nebulous thing. It is a tip of the spear thing, and it is actually appears what natural selection is actually selecting for, which kind of makes sense because, you know, if I'm smart enough, I can swim faster. I can see better at night. I can, you know, all sorts of things. I can survive in space if I need to. So, anyways, hopefully that explains some stuff about IQ to you guys. If you guys want to know more about the validity of IQ tests and issues of like cultural bias, or if it's okay to use IQ tests, the findings are true that there are group differences as well as individual differences, and what that means, and